The first part of John went very slowly. It took us a while to get through each chapter. It took us 3 weeks to get through chapter 8. Well, what's going to happen now is John 9, 10, and 11, we'll go one chapter a week. So we're going to fly through these because 9 and 11 are stories that really can't be broken up. And 10 is a new teaching that's kind of put with another repeated teaching that John has talked about earlier, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time there. So the next 3 weeks we'll go 9, 10, 11, and then we'll be in 12. And then 13 through 17 is that last night with Jesus with his disciples, and we'll really slow that down. So just want to keep you aware. We're still going every week. I can't imagine that here in the next few weeks we'll be taking a week off. Probably go all the way till Memorial Day before we take a week off. There is one possibility. My wife's going to go see my grandkids, and she's twisting my arm to take off and go with her. So maybe at the end of April we might take 1 week off. I'm not sure yet. So we'll kind of play that by ear. So we will see. So John 9 is a story now of a blind man. And in John chapter 1, if you'll remember, verses 4 and 5 talked about Jesus was light in the darkness, and this light gives life. Correct? John chapter 7 and 8, the whole context is there was different comments about him being light of the world. And especially in chapter 8, there was a lot there about light of the world. So the whole theme that was running through there is Jesus is light and life. Satan is darkness and death. The religious leaders seem to have Satan as their father, darkness and death, whereas many of his followers are light and life. So now what John is going to do is he's going to tell a story about an encounter between Jesus and the Pharisees and a blind man. And the story is a physical story, but it's a metaphor for light and darkness. Because you're going to see how the Pharisees react to him is more like death and darkness, and how Jesus responds to him is more like light and life. And so it's a physical miracle, but it's really a spiritual story to illustrate everything we've talked about for the previous 4 or 5 weeks. Okay? So we're going to jump in here. There's a lot of reading. I can't remember, 41 verses maybe. It sets up like a play, and so we're going to look at it like a play. I'm going to stop a couple of times for you guys to have discussions. And then when we get to the end of the story, we'll have some discussion time around the table and application. Okay? So, we begin in John chapter 9, verse 1 through 5, which is either scene 1 of the play or really more like a prologue that's just setting up the story. It says, as he went along, he saw a blind man who was blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now there was a rabbinic saying that said there is no death without sin, and there's no suffering without iniquity. And so in Jewish thought, anytime you saw someone who had a sickness, an illness, or a disease, the problem was tied to the sin in their life. And it could be their sin, or it could be an inherited sin from their family. And so his disciples, Jesus' disciples, are not being disrespectful. They're not being rude. They're asking a legitimate question that comes out of their paradigm for pain and suffering. They ask the question, okay, here's a blind man. So obviously, he either has sin in his life or his parents have sin in their lives, and God is judging his parents through his disability. And so they're wanting to know the answer to that question. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. Some versions say there, the glory of God. The glory of God, which the glory of God is what? Simply the greatness of God. So it's either the greatness of God, the glory of God, or the work of God might be displayed in his life. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Okay, so he said that again. He's reaffirming, I am God. I am the light of the world. So he says, listen, there's a time coming pretty soon where I'm not going to be here. So we've got to make hay while the sun shines. While I'm here, we've got to be about the Father's business. And I'm going to tell you, this man was born blind for this reason. Because through him, you're going to see the glory and the greatness of God displayed. That's why he was born blind. I am the light of the world, and I'm going to show you my light today by what happens with this man. Okay, so I'm going to stop here because there's this great question that we have to struggle with around the tables and up on the video today, and that is this. Jesus says that here is a man that was born blind. He's in the middle of pain and suffering, and the reason for the pain and the suffering so that the greatness of God or the work of God might be displayed. What does that mean? So, I want you to just think around your tables. What does it mean that Jesus says the greatness of God will be displayed in this man's life? Talk about it for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll continue on with the story. Before we continue on with the story, let me just say this. There are many reasons why pain and suffering exist in the world, correct? And because we're not God, we don't know most of those reasons. And it's easy for us, in our very narrow understanding of God, for us to begin to presume why people suffer, why people are in pain. And can God bring pain as a judgment because of sin? Absolutely. That's one of the reasons. But Jesus is very clear here that that's not the reason this man was born blind. This man was born blind because God was going to use his illness, his blindness, to show the glory of God, to show the greatness of God. In this case, it's going to be a miraculous healing. In other cases, it can be God uses someone's disability as a huge testimony to bring other people to Christ, right? So we have to be very careful as human beings when we start trying to play God and explain why so-and-so has a disability and so-and-so's sick and so-and-so has cancer and so-and-so's not healed and so-and-so is. It's not necessarily as cut and dried as we want to make it in our mind. It's multifaceted, but it all comes back to what? The sovereignty of God and the glory of God. God is in it doing something for His greatness. And so if you find yourself in a place where you're struggling with something, a disability, or maybe cancer, or maybe a health concern, or maybe some sort of suffering, it may be that God's trying to get your attention and you have a sin in your life. It may be that God's wanting to use you and your testimony and the way you handle it to really show His greatness and His glory. So does that make sense to you? And that's what's going to happen here. And the greatness here is that this blind man is going to be healed. So let's go on to scene 2, 9, 6 through 12. Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with a saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. He told him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." That word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Now, here's what I want you to notice, and you see this all the time in the Gospels. Very rarely does God, through Jesus, just heal someone. Usually He has them do something as an act of faith, and that act of faith is a part of the process of God healing them. In this case, He tells the man, He puts mud on his eyes. Now, can you imagine being a blind man, and you can't see anything, and all of a sudden you hear voices around you, and this guy, all of a sudden, you hear him spit a loogie and rub it in his hands and slap it on your eyes? You know, at first you might go, oh, here we go, the bullies on the playground again, right? But then he talks to this guy and says, listen, I'm going to heal you today, but I need you to have enough faith. Here's all I ask you to do is have enough faith to go wash this off your eyes. And so what does he do? He goes exactly where Jesus tells him, the pool of Siloam, and he washes it off of his eyes. And the result of his faith, the result of his obedience, is that he's now perfectly 20/20 vision. So I want you to imagine this. This man that morning was led out to sit and be a beggar somewhere because that's the only lot he had in life. That afternoon, and let's assume this guy's 25 or 30 years old, maybe 15, maybe 20. We don't know how old he is, but he's an adult-ish, right? So let's just assume here now he's been blind for 20 years. Can you imagine the change in your reality when you've never seen before in your life, and all of a sudden one day, boom, you can see 20/20 vision? Now watch what happens. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging said, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am that man." "How then were your eyes open?" they demanded. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. Now, we're not talking the Pharisees. We're talking the common people. We're talking his neighbors that live in their little neighborhood. And every day, they see this kid being led by his parents to his regular spot to go beg, and every day they see him lead him back. It always happens at 6:30 in the morning, and he always comes home at 6:30 at night, and they have this routine. They see it every day. Well, all of a sudden, it's 2 in the afternoon, and here's this kid walking around. He doesn't have a cane, and he doesn't have his parents leaning on his arm. He's just walking around fully seeing. And their paradigm, don't miss this, their paradigm has them so blinded to reality that because they see the guy out of context, against what they're used to, they are not even sure it's him. Well, it's just a lookalike. It's just somebody else that's kind of like him. It couldn't be him. And they start this discussion, almost debate over, is this the guy or not the guy? And he's standing right there with them going, "I really am the guy. I was blind this morning. This guy healed me, and now here I am." But they're having a hard time believing it. They're questioning that. It's interesting. Can I pick on you if you don't mind? Kelsey had an ongoing back problem for years, correct? And he went to a healing service. Oh, goodness, it's been a year now, almost, hasn't it?
Yeah, no.
6, 7 months? And in that service, God healed him. I mean, absolutely healed him. But my guess is, and it's a little more than a guess because I know you've told me this, that there are certain people in your life that look at you like you're just kind of crazy and that you have no idea what you're talking about because their paradigm won't let them believe that that's a possibility for you. Correct?
When I knelt down on the ground, it popped it into place.
Yeah, and it was a healing. And then he goes and starts telling his friends. Some people rejoiced. We did. Your table did here, right? But some people were like, "That's got to be psychosomatic. That stuff doesn't happen," right? They're just like the neighbors. Just like the neighbors. Now, look at scene 3. Because, remember, in that culture, who were the experts? The Pharisees. So the neighbors now decide to bring the Pharisees in to render a judgment whether this really was the man or not and whether or not he was really healed. So remember, this kid, this guy, this man, that morning was blind, this afternoon has sight. He's ready to throw a party. He's ready for somebody to rejoice with him, and he can't find anybody to rejoice with him. In fact, what he becomes is a huge theological debate over whether or not this guy could be healed or not. So watch what happens. Think about it from his perspective as we read through this. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Okay, so they say to him, "Hey, come with us. We're going to go talk to the Pharisees. They're the really brilliant ones in our culture. They'll tell us whether it's really you and whether you really are just faking." Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was the Sabbath. Oh boy, here we go. Ready? Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God. He doesn't keep the Sabbath." Because the very fact you would take dirt and spit on it and rub it, according not to God, but to the Pharisees and their rules about God, this movement right here could constitute work. So therefore, he's working on the Sabbath. Healing on the Sabbath is certainly work. Therefore, Jesus can't be of God because he broke our rules. But the others said, "How can a sinner do such miraculous signs?" So see, there are some Pharisees who are saying, "Wait a minute, this guy, This kid was blind this morning, and now he can see. He's done a miraculous sign. We've got to give him some credit here. We've at least got to think about this. So they were divided. Sometimes we think it was all of the Pharisees against all of the crowds. It wasn't that simple. The Pharisees were divided. The crowds were divided at times. Jesus was a very divisive figure, wasn't he? Especially when he did things on the Sabbath. So finally, they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. So now this guy, who for the first time in his life can see, and he's wanting to have a party to rejoice his sight, is now in with the Pharisees, having to defend himself and Jesus, and it has become a real political nightmare. The man replied, point blank, look at his faith. Look at how he's willing to stand up for Jesus in spite of opposition. He says, he's a prophet. It's not, maybe he's a prophet. It's, he could be a prophet. Well, I have a tendency to think maybe that this group is right. He says, I know who he is. He's a prophet. Standing up for his faith. The Jews still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. This is kind of funny, isn't it? This guy has been there for years at the same spot. And now, here he is, for the first day in his life, he can see, he's walking around there going, we just don't believe it. We're just not going to believe it. In fact, we're sending for your parents. And we're going to see what your parents have to say about this. So they send for his parents. Is this your son? They asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he can now see? Now, I'm going to make a couple of assumptions here. I'm assuming that his dad was at work out in the field or fishing or doing whatever he was. I'm assuming his mom was busy around the house. I'm assuming his parents didn't even know. But yet the Pharisees are putting it on the parents. Remember their paradigm, right? Because if this guy was blind, either he's the sinner or his parents are the sinner, which would mean by definition they wouldn't be allowed in the synagogue. Certainly the man born blind, his parents probably were. But if the parents say the wrong thing, what could happen to them? They could get ousted from the synagogue. And you have to remember, this is hard for us to imagine, but the political, the economic, and the religious system in Israel were all wrapped up in the same people. It was the Pharisees and the temple. That's where everything took place, and they didn't want to put at risk their political future, their economic future, and their religious future, right? So there's a lot of pressure on them here. So verse 20, they say, well, we know he is our son. Well, thanks a lot. And we know that he was born blind. So that's what we know. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. So see, we know that this guy's at least a young man. He is of age. That probably Jewish-wise means at least 13 or 14. I really think the guy's probably 20. I don't know why I feel that way, but he's certainly old enough to answer for himself. Let him speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. That is why his parents said, he is of age, ask him. Could we go back to the perspective of this young man for a minute? All of his life blind. All of his life told, well, you're not allowed to go to the synagogue because you have sin in your life. The reason you're blind is because you're defective. Because you're not as good as other people. For all of his life, every day, his only hope was sitting there hoping somebody would put a little bit of coins or money in his cup that he held. That's all life had to offer him. He would never go to church. He would never get married. He would never have a family. He would never be accepted by community. The only people that would care about him at all would be his parents. Until he met Jesus Christ, and it changed his whole world. And I can't imagine what he must have been feeling when he could see and he couldn't wait. I just think his expectations had to be, I'm going to go home and have a party, and people are going to rejoice, and they're not going to believe that this happened, and they're going to be so excited for me. And for the first time in my life, I'm going to be able to go to the synagogue, and I'm going to be able to have friends, and maybe I'm going to have a future. Maybe I'll be able to get married and have kids and have a normal life and get a job. There's a whole lot wrapped up in all this for this guy. And now here he is a couple of hours later, and he doesn't have a friend in the world. And in fact, the only people he could depend on in his life were who? His parents. And they just turned their back on him. Well, we know that's our son. Yeah, it looks a lot like him. And well, apparently he can see. But we don't want anything to do with this controversy. We don't want to get kicked out of the synagogue. We're not saying anything. He's old enough. He can speak for himself. We're going home. They desert their son during his time of greatest need. Can you imagine the expectations from the moment he was healed until this time? Going from exhilaration, my life has been changed for the better, to the only people I could count on in the world have now deserted me. That's just brutal. And here's what's so sad is, the Pharisees, what do they care about? They care about this kid? They care about his parents? Do they even care about truth? They care about one thing, and what's that? Discrediting Jesus. That's all they care about this. They say, we know that Jesus is a sinner. Okay? And so here's what he says to them. He replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Okay, so they're wanting this young man to testify against Jesus, and he refused to do it. They said, we know he's a sinner. And this young man says, I don't know if he's a sinner or not, but I can tell you this, I was blind and now I can see. That evidence is obvious. Then they ask him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? See, they're questioning him for a second time. Same questions. So he answered, I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Don't miss that. This kid is angry, he's sarcastic, he's offended, and he comes right at the most important, powerful people in the culture. Because of why? Because what Jesus had done in his life. Because what Jesus had done in his life. I got to tell you a funny story about Kelsey. Kelsey goes to this healing service and gets his back healed. He's exuberant. He's so excited. He calls and tells me about it. For a couple of months afterwards, every time we got together, that's all he talked about was, man, I'm still healed. This is so awesome. Kelsey told everybody in his world about the healing. In fact, he told people that didn't really want to hear it. And I remember specifically, you tell me a story about he went to a bar in his neighborhood and sat down with people in the bar and was testifying in the bar to these people about how God had healed him. And these drunk people in the bar weren't necessarily interested in what Kelsey had to say. But you know why Kelsey was there saying it? Because when you've been touched by the hand of God, everybody just has to know. That's what evangelism is. This kid is healed, and he is going to have allegiance to Jesus Christ come hell or high water. And if it's the most important people in culture, and it cost him the synagogue, and it cost him his reputation, if it cost him his parents, he's not backing down because he's been touched by the hand of God. He's seen the glory of God, and he's not going to back down from his experience. And I saw that with Kelsey. And yet, how many people in the world, when you tell about an experience, they don't want to hear it, it just can't happen, and in fact, they are completely turned off by your faith. You guys ever experienced that before? And that's where this man finds himself. And so finally, he says, they're not going to be reasonable. They're not going to listen to me. So you know what? I'm going to come right back at them. Oh, I've already told you this once. I'll tell you again. Is it because you want to be his disciples too? Is that why you're asking these questions? No, it's because they want to kill him. So, we wrap up the story. They hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." Now, there's a little bit of irony here, because one, what did we find out from chapter 8? When the Pharisees get put in a place where they don't know how to argue or come back, they start hurling insults at people. Remember they did that to Jesus in the last chapter? It's also ironic that the whole phrase, "I am," that big God phrase where he says, "I am," that comes from Exodus when Moses was standing before God, right? And Jesus keeps saying to them, "I am the light of the world. I am before Moses was. This is who I am. I am the bread of life." He said that back in John chapter 6, I think. He keeps saying these things over and over again. I am, I am, I am. They're saying now, well, we follow Moses. And yet Jesus has made it very clear, I'm the God that revealed himself to Moses, and they won't accept him as anything other than someone they needed to get rid of. There's a little bit of irony there in how they claim Moses but reject the God of Moses. Okay? So we come down here to the end. It says, the man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to godly men who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." In other words, remember what Jesus said in John chapter 8 that we talked about last week? You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And this kid is speaking truth. He's saying, let's just look at truth. Truth is you know as well as I do that as if this man were just some sinner, he wouldn't be able to perform these miracles. The simple fact he can make me see says that he is who he claims to be, the Son of God. And here's what they said. To this man they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. You were steeped in sin at birth. They just, you're a sinner. We owe nothing to you. You get out of here and never come back. And that was the encounter, the parable between Jesus and this blind man and the Pharisees. Now, last part here. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found them, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I might believe in him." Remember the whole theme of John is what? Belief, right? Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Then Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world so that the blind will see, and those who see or claim to see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and said, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." So it's the upside down world of the kingdom of God. The only person that could see in the story was who? The blind man. And everyone else, his parents, the neighbors, the Pharisees, everyone else who claimed they could see, who were in the synagogue, who were the religious people, they were so blinded by their presuppositions they couldn't see the truth standing right before them, including a man that for 18 or 20 years had been blind that now can see, and they're blinded even to that. That was the extent of their spiritual blindness. And so at the end of it, the Pharisees, of course, hate Jesus worse, but here's this man who is now a believer, believes in Jesus Christ because of the encounter with him. So here's what we want to do. I took you through that story very quickly, but what a powerful story. So I want to begin our group time right now, and on the video. I want you to turn off the video and just do this. Just discuss for a minute or two just your initial response to the story. Just what do you think of this story? What does this story say to you? And then we'll come back and we'll do some specific application of the story in a moment. So Jesus comes and brings light to the darkness of sin. Here's what I want you to know. The greatest healing on that day was not the healing of the blind man's eyes. The greatest healing on that day was the transformation of the blind man's heart. Correct? Because anything physically that Jesus does, that is only to set up what he's going to do spiritually. And when you read through Scripture and you look at all the amazing, miraculous physical healings he did, those are just icing on top of the cake for the real miracle. The real miracle is always the transformation of a person's heart. And so this is a story about a physical healing, but it's really a story about spiritual healing. And the biggest issue in our lives is not our physical sight, it's our spiritual sight. And so what we want to do is we want to close out today with a little time around the tables, and we're going to turn off the video for the last time now, for you to ask the question, are you spiritually 20/20 sight? Or are you 20/80? Or are you 2200? Or are you spiritually blind? Because this issue is not about healing someone's eyes. This issue is about the condition of your heart. Can you see spiritually? And so we're going to close out by asking a couple of questions about your spiritual blindness and or sight and the work of Jesus in your life.